Okay, thanks. So thank you, Ingrid, for the opportunity to speak about this topic. It was, I get lots of calls at work on this topic, and so it was really good for me to have to do some more in-depth research. So I hope I answer the question, why monitor, particularly in relation to high-risk individuals. Look at some evidence supporting seizure monitoring, look at some seizure monitors on the market and currently under trial or in research, and I have focused on monitors that really are either available to purchase in Australia or to import. So apologies to those listening, streaming from all over the world. And it's a growing field. And I importantly want to look at some limitations, and there are plenty of limitations, and a few other brief key considerations. The most important reason to monitor, particularly in high-risk individuals, is to reduce avoidable deaths and injuries, and particularly avoidable deaths from SUDEP, and there'll be discussion about that later today, and from status epilepticus, which some of your children will be prone to. Some studies report that 40 to 60% of deaths in people with epilepsy are potentially avoidable. And we know that the greatest risk factor for SUDEP is a 3 or more generalised tonic-clonic seizures in a year, and that risk increases with increasing frequency of seizures. And we know from a lot of SUDEP research that a lot of people who die of SUDEP die alone at home, in bed, often found in a prone position, and there's often, but not always, evidence that a seizure has occurred. As your children mature and develop through adolescence and adulthood, some seizure monitoring may actually help to increase their independence. Seizure monitoring hopefully reduces care burden and increases peace of mind, and I think most importantly, and this is often overlooked, it does help or can help assess the effectiveness of treatment. So just briefly a bit of evidence, and my research for this topic, there's just a massive amount of research out there. Not all of it is highly credible. One of the studies that really made an impact on me when I was doing my search was the 2013 Mortimer study, and this study actually looked at SUDEP deaths and near SUDEP deaths or cases in hospital video EEG monitoring units. And in the SUDEP deaths, there was a delayed nursing intervention of 10 minutes or more, and in the near SUDEP cases, there was much, much more prompt intervention of 3 minutes or less. So I think that's really significant. There are lots of journal reports of monitoring, particularly nighttime monitoring, reducing the risk of SUDEP. They often talk about nighttime monitoring in particular being protective, but there was one study, a UK study, that actually reported that listening devices and nocturnal supervision increases, they estimated it decreased the risk of SUDEP in the order of 80 to 90%. Interesting this year, the American Academy of Neurology and the American Epilepsy Society actually produced and published evidence-based SUDEP practice guidelines for doctors who diagnose and treat people with epilepsy. And I'm only going to mention that one of the guidelines is that they recommend doctors discuss the value or the pros and cons of nocturnal monitoring, particularly with their high-risk patients. And indeed, they go so far as to say that the risk of SUDEP is likely to be reduced if someone else is co-sharing in that room and that person is over the age of 10 and of normal intelligence. So that really obviously is a challenging thing for lots of families, but it was interesting that they particularly made that comment. I think we also have to temper this, though, by a 2017 very recent Cochrane report that showed that there's very limited low-quality evidence at the moment that supervision at night prevents SUDEP. So that's a bit sort of sobering, really. So I'm going to talk about a few seizure devices, but I just want to mention, first and foremost, I'm not an expert about the engineering and science underpinning these devices. This is not an exhaustive list. Some of these devices will be very familiar to some of you in the audience today. I do have a very, very good handout that has been created by my OT colleague Elise Woodruff that gives you much more detailed information about these devices in terms of functionality, the pros and cons, cost, and where you can source them. So I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. So I'm sure there will be people in the audience here today who have an EMFET alarm at home, and this is a monitor that, a detection device, it's a motion detective device. It is only suitable for use in bed, and it is only suitable for detecting tonic-clonic seizures. But there has actually been some independent hospital testing that's shown that it's really probably the most reliable version of this type of mattress monitor, and I do have copies of that article for you today. I don't know whether anyone here is using the SAMI, the sleep activity monitor, but it's a video-based movement detection system. It has an infrared camera that detects motions during the night and alerts parents or carers on their Apple device. And interestingly, the events are recorded and archived, which could be very useful for medical consultations. LifeMinder is something that we've become more recently aware of. It's a wearable device that detects the sudden impact of a fall, so whether it's due to a seizure or something else. It can alert up to 5 people by sending a text message with a Google Map location accurate to within 2 metres. And the wearer can also press the SOS and alert carers as well. Some of you may have children or young adults wear it using the smartwatch. It monitors movement, and really it is a device that's really only suited to detect tonic-clonic seizures, and it now can be used either on an Android or Apple. And I know there are probably people here who have the Embrace watch from Empatica. Similarly, it really is fundamentally has a motion detector and most useful for tonic-clonic seizures. It claims that it can monitor activity levels, whatever that means, and sleep quality. And when it does detect a seizure, it will send alert calls and an SMS to caregivers' phones. So they're just a sample of a few. I really wanted to mention this WAD or wearable apnea detection device that's currently under study in the UK at the University College London and Imperial College London. And it's a wearable device to monitor breathing in people with epilepsy. And we know from a lot of research that a decrease in respirations is really part of the sequence leading to SUDEP in many, many people. Not all cases, but many. And interestingly, this clinical trial is funded partly from a grant from SUDEP Action, which I'm sure many of you would have heard of. So I think this is really, really important, and I have no doubt the clinical trial will be very comprehensive and useful. I just briefly wanted to mention this device. There was an interesting article published this year in September it's a bit of a mouthful, the Journal of Engineering and Medicine and Biology Society. And it discusses a new seizure device that combines really a number of functionality. It's got a body motion detector. It monitors breathing rate, ECG and EDA. And what it claims to do is to continuously transmit data to a smartphone app. And then this app then decides on the chance of a seizure occurring in real time based on anomaly detection, and testing on synthetic data has revealed a really high precision rate to date. It's not commercially available. The WAD is not commercially available, and I certainly haven't found any independent clinical sort of trial reports of this device. Now, what about other options? And Margot happened to show an image of a pulse oximeter for home use. I couldn't find any reliable research that says a pulse oximeter is useful in terms of reducing risk from status and SUDEP. It's cheap, and by all means discuss it with your doctor, but in terms of reliable, good, robust evidence, I couldn't find anything. There is a gadget you can import from the UK called the Pulse Guard, which monitors pulse, and you set the parameters, and if the pulse deviates from the parameters you've set, it sends an alert to an iPad. The only problem with this is there's absolutely no independent clinical evidence of efficacy to date, and I'm not aware, I don't know, I think a trial is underway, but there's no published data, and it's incredibly expensive. It ranges from $1,100 to £1,500. Some people choose to use infant breathing monitors when their children are very, very little, but obviously they're only useful when kids are very little. You might want to consider a bed and exit door monitor. If you have someone who tends to wander during focal seizures or in a post-ictal confusional state, they can be useful. Anti-suffocation pillows, well, I couldn't find any robust independent clinical evidence that they're effective. Indeed, SUDEP Action has a really interesting article by Stephen Brown around the use of anti-suffocation pillows, and in fact he argues that a lot of the deaths that were previously attributed to suffocation in people with epilepsy in the past were probably SUDEP deaths. And of course, seizure response dogs, there's a lot of interest in this space, but the reality is it's not a solution for most people. These dogs cost up to about $35,000 to train, can take at least 2 years. And once again, there's really a lack of robust clinical evidence that a dog can actually detect the early onset of a seizure even before it becomes clinically evident. You certainly can train dogs to respond and to alert caregivers, so it's problematic. And just briefly, running out of time, limitations just really quickly. They mainly detect tonic-clonic seizures, the current models, but that's really important because they're very risky seizures. Cost is prohibitive, there's limited funding options, there can be installation difficulties, user error. You've got to consider servicing and after-sale support, particularly if you're buying from overseas. What about lack of privacy? Charging downtimes can be great. You can't trial or hire, generally. There's a lack of robust scientific evidence, as I've mentioned. Lots of false positives with some of them and missed seizures. There's potential bias in some studies and some misleading information on some websites, and indeed even some claim that their devices are effective at preventing SUDEP without any supporting evidence. So just brief, and just I want to highlight SUDEP Actions has got some fantastic questions you should ask of device manufacturers or retailers when you're considering, and I've got copies for you. Limit the influence of social media. Discuss the notion of seizure monitoring and devices with your child's neurologist. SUDEP Actions, fantastic source of information, SUDEP Aware, and so on. Do a risk assessment and develop a safety plan. And I think I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. That was a tour de force. I think you see just how murky the space is. You're all terribly worried. We're all terribly worried, but there's no clear fix-it. And I think, Lisa, hopefully we'll be here at lunchtime.
I'm staying for the day.
Good, so that you can grab Lisa and grab her brochures. We are short of time. I've made the chair's decision that lunch is pushed back to 1:30 so that we get 45 minutes in our other sessions. And I'm just going to, is there any question in the audience that's burning? There's someone in New Zealand, Louise in New Zealand, thank you for the question. She's asked whether they can get the brochure referred to, please, with information about the monitoring devices. What I suggest is that my team, I don't know if Krista's around, but someone on my team would scan that back on Monday and then manage to put it on the website. We can fix that one. And there's a question I'm going to take because of time, which is, are there any devices you would suggest for a child who has many absence seizures? If they're true absence seizures, you probably don't need a monitoring device in terms of risk to life because they're only 5 or 10 seconds. There's another one, what's the best outcome for nocturnal seizures in Dravet syndrome? I think that's a very hard one in terms of you really covered the devices. Is there a question in the audience? Just because I haven't tortured Lisa. Oh, yes.
Are there any legal ramifications adults get their permission with video monitoring through the night?
Well, I'm certainly not aware of legal ramifications, but I think there are privacy issues to consider.
But again, as the clinician's perspective on that, I sometimes have that, particularly with community residential units where my adults go and the carers won't take responsibility for monitoring them overnight, and that terrifies me. And I think safety is probably ahead of that with the severely disabled adults that are having seizures all night. So I fight very hard for them to get awake carers overnight. It's incredibly difficult space, much easier in paediatrics where you've got loving parents. Thank you so much. Oh, just a second. I've got a nice little present here for you. Thank you. Please join with me in thanking Lisa.